Once again, welcome to our live coverage of the 79th United Nations General Assembly meeting taking place in New York. News Central is on the ground with our correspondent Bernard Akede, who of course has been covering a number of things happening on the sidelines. We've been bringing you the speeches of some of the world's top players, including, of course, African presidents. We head right now to the UN General Assembly, where His Excellency Lazarus Chakwera, the President of the Republic of Malawi and Commander-in-Chief of the Malawi Defense Force of the Republic of Malawi, is speaking.
In three dimensions: cooperation, competition, and conflict. And how we manage our relationships on these dimensions will ultimately determine the kind of world we will create for the children of tomorrow. So when we sit in this chamber to deliberate on the cooperation or competition or conflict between member states, we are actually designing and deciding our future. I am therefore glad that the theme of our debate this year touches on all three of these dimensions, because the bottom line is that in all three we can and must do better. This year's theme calls on us to act together to advance peace, sustainable development, and dignity. This is a call to stronger multilateral cooperation. But if we are serious about cooperation, then we must act with urgency in fixing and reforming the United Nations and other multilateral institutions. And one fix that we from Africa demand is for the United Nations to embrace democracy in the Security Council by giving 2 permanent seats to Africa with veto power. When I first made this call in my inaugural address in this chamber, I was delighted to hear President Biden also announce that the United States is in favor of this reform. Similarly, when I met President Xi Jinping of China 3 weeks ago, I was delighted to hear that he too is in favor of stronger representation of the interests of developing countries in the Security Council. So, Mr. President, the time to fix this is now. We need this fix to strengthen our voice on the issues that matter to us in Africa. In the 4 years that I have been president, I have declared state of national disaster every year because of climate change impacts that we cannot solve without multilateral cooperation. And for one of those years, I was chair of 2 development communities, namely the Southern Africa Development Community, SADC, and the least developed countries, LDCs. And I learned firsthand that no nation can survive a global crisis or develop in the face of shocks without strong multilateral cooperation to sustain it. Even this year, I see how challenging it has been for my country and for Malawians. Coming off the back of the state of national disaster that I declared last year to secure international cooperation in response to the devastation caused by Cyclone Freddy, I had to declare another state of natural disaster this year to secure international cooperation in response to El Niño weather conditions that have destroyed crops in 3/4 of the country's districts, leaving 1/5 of the Malawian population without enough food to last the year. And this is happening in the face of devastating trauma we have suffered as a nation for the past 3 months, from the tragic death of our Vice President, Right Honorable Dr. Saulos Klaus Chilima, in a plane crash, whose cause is yet to be established by the German experts we have asked to investigate the accident. Yet another example of the necessity of international cooperation. Even the great strides of development we have made over the past 4 years have been facilitated by strong international cooperation, whether it be the 4 road corridors and hundreds of secondary schools we are constructing through our cooperation with the United States, or the M1 road we are rehabilitating and expanding through our cooperation with the European Union, or the railway line system we have revived for the first time in 40 years through our cooperation with China, or the orthopedic and neurosurgery hospital we have developed through the cooperation with Norway, or the Makanjira Road we are ready to develop through our cooperation with Saudi Arabia, or the investments we are making to strengthen education and governance institutions through our cooperation with the United Kingdom, or the solar power plants that we have developed through our cooperation with Japan, or the extended credit facility from the International Monetary Fund that has unlocked access to the World Bank's and IDEA support through cooperation with development partners, or the life-saving food assistance we mobilized for the people of Mangochi following the impact of Tropical Storm Anna through the cooperation with Iceland, or implementation of social protection programs to help rural women enjoy economic empowerment through our cooperation with Ireland, or the procurement of emergency food, fertilizers, and climate-resilient seeds for climate-ravaged Malawian communities through our cooperation with Tanzania, Ukraine, Egypt, Iceland, Russia, Morocco, and many others. Malawi is a testament to the power of cooperation to move a nation's development forward into an inclusively wealthy and sustainable future that is brighter than the past. It is, in fact, this foundation of international cooperation that we have built on to actively engage in intergovernmental negotiations for the pact of the future, for the future that we have fully endorsed at this 79th session of the General Assembly. It is also this foundation of international cooperation that we have built on to host 80 international organizations and institutions for our second annual Malawi Partners Conference right here in New York to get investor alignment to our ATM strategy of boosting productivity and value addition in the sectors of agriculture, tourism, and mining that hold the greatest promise for Malawi's economic transformation. If the future belongs to nations that know how to leverage the power of international cooperation, then the future belongs to Malawi. If the future belongs to nations with an apologetic commitment to multilateral collaboration, then the future belongs to Malawi. If the future belongs to nations that are driven by moral conviction to uphold the values of servant leadership, shared prosperity, ending corruption, and the rule of law, then the future belongs to Malawi. If the future belongs to nations that have adopted a no retreat and no surrender attitude towards the achievement of SDGs by 2030, then the future belongs to Malawi. If the future belongs to nations that put its children first, then the way that Malawi has done, by resolving to end child marriages and poisoning of children with lead products by 2030, that future belongs to Malawi. But, Mr. President, our efforts to move toward, in the fifth gear, toward these goals are being significantly slowed down by a global system of multilateral agencies and financial institutions that are too slow, too inefficient, too monolithic, and too undemocratic for the kind of speedy and tailor-made interventions that we need. As a result of our refusal to practice the democracy of equal representation here in the UN, our calls for member states to practice democracy in their jurisdictions are beginning to fall on deaf ears. As a result of our refusal to honor climate financing pledges or link them to debt relief, the debt to GDP ratios in developing countries like Malawi are growing at alarming rates, posing a significant threat to global financial stability. If this is not fixed, those who keep us in a state of perpetual debt, when they have the resources to cancel those debts, should make no mistake, the spreading debt crisis in the developing world is a cancer that will make your own economies unsafe. So the time to fix this is now. Mr. President, I said that the second dimension of international relations is competition. And again, in this area, we all can and must do better. There is nothing wrong with healthy competition between nations, because competition fuels innovation, improves quality, and multiplies options for citizens, which is the essence of freedom. But as we have done in global sports, we must make competition between nations fair by regularly reviewing and revising the rules on which our international system is based, to ensure that the way nations compete and what they compete for is not rigged to disenfranchise some countries as we compete for natural resources, international markets, financial support, and the new technologies, which are currently skewed against the global south. Even with the era of artificial intelligence being fully upon us, I worry that the rules for regulating this arena are already being written to empower some nations and give them unfair advantages over others. We need more than a rules-based system. We also need the rules themselves to foster fair competition. Of course, what this means is that we need stronger governance institutions that can enforce fair rules for accessing education, markets, technology, financing, and natural resources. It is therefore my central contention, Mr. President, that the one place we must have strong governance is here. If governance is weak here, there will be no one to regulate the collaboration and competition between nations in an equitable manner. And it is this absence of equity that is at the root of unwinnable conflicts in Eastern Europe, in Palestine, in Eastern DRC, and counting. We need governance reform to make the United Nations stronger, because the world needs a strong UN that can be good and peaceful, not a weak UN that can only be harmless. And we need it now. Thank you for your attention.
On behalf of the Assembly, I wish to thank the President of the Republic of Malawi and Commander-in-Chief.
And that was the President of Malawi, Lazarus Chakwera, there with his address to the United Nations General Assembly. A lot of things he said taking direct hit, or rather direct aim at the UN itself. We are expecting the President of Kenya to be speaking any moments from now. We'll be taking that live as well, and that's President William Ruto. I do believe I may be able to get one or two questions directed to Bernard Akede and Adeshewa Josh, I beg your pardon, who are joining me right now. Lady and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me. Just very quickly, because we're expecting to see William Ruto on the podium. Adeshewa, a lot of things that the President of Malawi said, but I'll ask you, what stuck out to you between the conversation about AI, reforming the United Nations, the issues around climate change, as well as ensuring free trade around the world? What was your highlight?
Two main things here, Tolu. One is the debt cancellation. And he said he was very direct, as you rightly mentioned. He said those who can cancel our debt but have refused to do that so that they can keep us owing them and robbing us of our...
Adeshewa, just hold on a minute. I thought I'd have at least 2 minutes with you, but William Ruto is on the podium, so let's go straight to the speech by the President of Kenya at the 79th United Nations General Assembly. We'll be back.
dignity for everyone, everywhere, which resonates with the core principles of the 2030 Agenda and aligns closely with the core values and mission of the United Nations. Excellencies, the world is at a challenging moment and in a most precarious international security dispensation. The promise of the United Nations Charter to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war has been profoundly shaken. From land to sea and from air to the outer space, global peace, security, and stability are increasingly under threat. Conflicts and tensions pervade every frontier, undermining the collective security that international cooperation seeks to uphold. Cases of polarizing narratives, factionalism, social upheavals, organized crime, war, and stockpiling of weapons of mass destruction are at an all-time high. Great power rivalry is intensifying, provoking regional competition and inducing geopolitical and geoeconomic realignments and tensions. The subtle nuances of them versus us has produced negative coalitions, wars, tensions, as well as eroded trust and confidence in global multilateral system. From Gaza to Darfur, Ukraine, Yemen, Eastern DRC, the Sudan, the Sahel, and the criminality in Haiti, conflict is inflicting a trail of destruction of life and livelihoods in historic proportions. These conflicts have become battlegrounds for armed factions, external interventions, and proxy wars, resulting in unprecedented anarchic situations and long-lasting negative repercussions on global stability and economic development. The world cannot realize durable peace, security, and shared prosperity when emphasis is being put on what divides rather than what brings us together. We must therefore promote approaches that support positive competition for all. The perilous security landscape is further complicated by emerging threats stemming from human advancement. Cybersecurity threats and sophisticated cyber attacks on critical infrastructure pose significant risks to national security and global stability. Furthermore, the proliferation of advanced technologies such as artificial intelligence in the military domain and autonomous weapons systems has introduced new challenges for arms control and international regulation. Regrettably, the world's most powerful states have increasingly chosen unilateralism and militarization over dialogue and diplomacy. As a consequence, the capacity of our multilateral institutions to maintain and enforce peace, even in national crises with significant regional impacts, is severely undermined. Even worse, a resurgence of nuclear arms race, buoyed by the intensifying geopolitical rivalries and tensions, has made the possibility of a catastrophic nuclear warfare a real possibility. Our vision of a world free from nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction is dying incrementally. We must not sit back and leave the future of upcoming generations to fate. We must intentionally rise to the occasion to meet the challenges of our time by reaffirming the core values of the UN Charter. We need to muster the political will and collectively reinforce our diplomatic efforts to confront the security threats through comprehensive, multi-pronged, and context-specific approaches. Excellencies, Kenya's commitment to international peace and security is unwavering. we continue investing in efforts that promote stability and harmony both within our region and beyond. We are committed to continuing to mediate, facilitate, and support peace initiatives and processes in our region, contributing to regional peace operations and the UN peacekeeping missions. Through our participation in the Africa Union Transition Mission in Somalia, we have stood side by side with our sisterly neighbor, Somalia, in their fight against Al-Shabaab. We are proud that Somalia will soon take up a seat as a non-permanent member of the Security Council, underscoring the tremendous progress achieved in consolidating peace and stability in that country. The UN must, however, continue to support Somalia in forging an agreement on the post-2024 security support. Kenya welcomes the adoption of the Security Council Resolution 2719, establishing a framework for financing Africa Union peace support operations through UN-assessed contributions, thereby enhancing our collective peacekeeping efforts. A well-funded AU peace operation are not only an African priority, but a global good, considering the complexity and interconnected nature of emerging threats to international peace and security. Earlier this year, under the request of the leadership of South Sudan, I launched the All-Inclusive Tumaini Initiative, bringing together the warring parties and the political leadership of South Sudan to address the root causes of the protracted conflict in that country. I commend the leadership of South Sudan and all the participating parties for their commitment to the peace process. I also thank all regional and international partners for their unwavering support, both political and financial, to the South Sudan Tumaini Initiative. Ladies and gentlemen, at the last General Assembly, I announced Kenya's readiness to lead a multinational security support mission to Haiti at the Haitian government's request. Following the Security Council's authorization under Resolution 2699, Kenya has deployed 382 specially trained police officers to Haiti. Just a few days ago, I had the opportunity to visit Haiti, witness the work of our officers in the field, and observe remarkable progress on the ground. Our support for the Haitian National Police has significantly advanced the pacification of cities and towns, protected critical infrastructure, and relieved many communities previously held captive by criminal gangs. I also commend Haiti's political leadership for forging an agreement and a promising roadmap towards free, fair, and democratic elections. We are deeply grateful for the financial and logistical support from the United States, Canada, and other member states that are shouldering this heavy burden. This has been critical to the MSS's deployment thus far. However, Kenya and other Caribbean and African countries are ready to deploy, but are hindered by insufficient equipment, logistics, and funding. I appeal to all member states to stand in solidarity with the people of Haiti by providing necessary support, either directly to MSS contributing countries or through the UN Trust Fund. I must emphasize, however, that Kenya will deploy the additional contingent towards attaining the target of all the 2,500 police officers by January next year. The progress so far in Haiti demonstrates that what was once deemed mission impossible is indeed a present and undeniable possibility. Mr. President, we must candidly acknowledge that international cooperation in its current form has clear limitations. It is constrained by entrenched systems and structures that prevent effective action and meaningful progress. Since the last General Assembly, the global situation has deteriorated across multiple fronts. Conflicts have deepened, economic disparities have widened, and the climate crisis has intensified. To address these challenges, we must rethink and reform global collaboration mechanisms, making them much more responsive, adaptable, and impactful. The existing international security architecture, represented by the UN Security Council, continues to hamper efforts to maintain international peace and security. The Council is, by all intents and purposes, dysfunctional, undemocratic, non-inclusive, unaccountable, autocratic, and at best, opaque. An institution that excludes 54 African countries with 1.4 billion people, while allowing one nation to veto decisions of the remaining 193 member states in the 21st century, is simply unacceptable. We must urgently seek to make the Security Council representative, inclusive, transparent, democratic, effective, and accountable. In Africa, we are not advocating for reform and collective action solely at the UN. In fact, we are also in the process of comprehensively reforming the African Union to become a fit-for-purpose institution that can effectively represent African nations globally and deliver prosperity. Excellencies, peace and development are inseparable pillars. One cannot flourish without the other. Yet, the 2024 Sustainable Development Goals report paints a bleak picture. Only 17% of targets are on track. Nearly half show minimal or moderate progress, and over one-third have stalled or regressed. The COVID-19 pandemic, escalating conflicts, geopolitical tensions, and climate change have severely impacted progress towards the SDGs and the Paris Agreement goals. Inadequate and unsustainable means of implementation, particularly in financing, technical support, and capacity building, continue to obstruct our efforts to realize the 2030 agenda. Biased methodologies employed by credit rating agencies further disadvantage African countries, making it more difficult to access affordable financing from international capital markets. Additionally, unilateral economic, financial, and trade measures not only impede the full achievement of economic and social development, but also undermine the principles of international cooperation, mutual respect, and sovereignty. Let us pause and reflect on the true significance of this predicament. Many countries in the global south are forced to choose between buying medicine and hospital equipment or paying their debt obligations, and between buying textbooks for school-going children or paying their debt obligations. They are forced to choose between hiring teachers and making sure that there is equipment in schools or paying their debt. I can go on and on. This is not an abstract illustration detached from daily reality, but the normal experience of millions of ordinary people. One must wonder what goes on in the minds of those who prioritize economic returns over people. Ladies and gentlemen, what really happened to humanity? Addressing these deep-rooted challenges requires transformative changes to build a more equitable and resilient global framework. We have outlined many of these solutions in the Pact of the Future, demonstrating our clear understanding of what needs to be done. However, we have yet to master the political will necessary to turn these commitments into action. It is a fundamental principle of development that no nation can achieve lasting prosperity if its neighbors remain impoverished. Our economies are interconnected, and the well-being of one directly impacts the other. We must ensure that developing countries have the necessary foundations to claim their rightful place in the 21st century global economy. This is not just a moral and fair imperative. It is a strategic necessity to address systemic challenges such as migration, labor market disparities, climate change, and global security. Strengthening these foundations requires reforming the international financial architecture, facilitating debt relief, concessional long-term at-scale financing, grants, and de-risking lending instruments is essential to increasing investment to develop vital infrastructure and expand critical sectors. Consider Africa's immense untapped potential in clean energy resources. Harnessing this potential is critical not only for the continent's economic growth and social resilience, but also for global priorities like accelerating the energy transition, combating climate change, and diversifying supply chains. Energy-hungry industries such as data centers, mineral processing, and manufacturing are seeking clean and affordable sources which Africa can provide in abundance. Yet, out of the 500 gigawatts of renewable energy added to the global mix in 2023, Africa accounted for less than 3 gigawatts. How is this possible, given the continent's vast natural resources, skilled workforce, and massive energy needs? We cannot allow Africa to be left behind this time round. Affordable financing is essential, but so are transformative policies and inclusive fair trade practices, market access, inclusive international tax cooperation, technology transfer, and capacity building. This is why, at COP28, we launched the Africa Green Industrialization Initiative, aimed at unlocking investments for the continent's immense opportunities. This Pan-African initiative promotes large-scale, high-impact, and bankable green industrial and infrastructure projects. Next month, in Nairobi, we will host an investment forum for the Accelerated Partnership for Renewables in Energy to attract investments for the untapped potential in solar, wind, geothermal, and hydropower. Globally, we also need to improve the tools we already have. The SDG Stimulus Fund, initiated by the Secretary General in 2023, requires our joint support to succeed, including from multilateral development banks. Similarly, replenishing the International Development Association, IDA, is essential to provide concessional loans to the world's poorest nations. Earlier this year, I hosted the IDA 21 Replenishment Summit in Nairobi, where African leadership reaffirmed the critical importance of IDA for developing countries and called for an ambitious replenishment of US dollars 120 billion. Our collective efforts must include trust and accountability to ensure that we fulfill our promises and our commitments. Additionally, we launched the Africa Club, the Alliance of African Multilateral Financial Institutions, to strengthen and support Africa's position in the global financial architecture. This body will serve as a powerful negotiator on behalf of the continent, coordinate with global financial institutions, and leverage African countries' balance sheets to increase investment and create jobs in Africa. We believe that African institutions such as the Afri-Exim Bank, Trade and Development Bank, the Africa Finance Corporation, among others, understand the continent even better. As part of the reform of the international financial architecture, we must not only reform the multilateral institutions, but also support and stop bias against these African institutions. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, climate change remains one of the greatest challenges of our time. Biodiversity loss and pollution have created environmental crises that upend lives, reverse progress in poverty reduction, and strain ecosystems to their breaking point. Extreme weather conditions continue to hinder the development aspirations of many countries, especially in Africa, where severe climate-related hazards are becoming more frequent and more intense. In 2022, over 110 million people in Africa were directly affected by climate-related disasters, resulting in more than $8.5 billion in economic damages. According to the Emergency Event Database, there were approximately 5,000 fatalities, though the toll is likely to be higher due to underreporting. We are at a crossroads, and the path to correcting the climate course is clear. COP29, to be held this November in Baku, Azerbaijan, presents a critical milestone in ensuring that the solutions we implement are rooted in fairness and opportunity for everybody. However, the new climate financing goal expected at COP29 faces significant hurdles as deep disagreements persist over who should contribute and how much funding is needed. Without swift resolution, these divisions risk derailing our collective progress on climate action, just as the global situation becomes increasingly urgent. Let me be clear. Political posturing and inaction will neither protect the vulnerable from the consequences of a runaway climate crisis, nor save our civilization from ecosystem collapse. It is therefore critical that all nations step forward to meet this moment with ambition and responsibility. As we confront the escalating impacts of climate change, we must also recognize the interconnected environmental challenges we face, such as plastic pollution, which continues to wreak havoc on ecosystems and threatens global sustainability. It is imperative that we adopt a robust global plastics treaty during the 5th round of negotiations in Busan in the Republic of Korea this November. Kenya fully supports an ambitious outcome and the African proposal to establish the Treaty Secretariat in Nairobi, thereby reinforcing UNEP's role. It is indeed unfortunate and regrettable, ladies and gentlemen, that UNEP is the only body where secretariats of conventions created under it are increasingly being carved out and located elsewhere. UNEP, being one of only 2 UN headquarters in the Global South, must not be cannibalized for whatever purpose or reason, let alone excuse. Mr. President, as the host country of UNEP and UN Habitat, I take this opportunity to thank the Assembly for approving the upgrade of the infrastructure at the United Nations office in Nairobi, the largest UN campus in the world. This project includes the construction of new office space and the design of ultra-modern conference facilities. These developments mark a significant milestone towards enhancing the quality and accessibility of Secretariat services to member states. Not only will they serve current needs, but they will also strengthen the future success of multilateralism. We look forward to the Assembly's continued support as construction begins in 2025. It will be critical to ensure that UNON receives sustainable and predictable resources to ensure the timely completion of this upgrade. Kenya will continue to play its part in ensuring that UNON fulfills its mandate. Accordingly, the Government of Kenya has undertaken extensive improvements and expansion of physical infrastructure around the complex and will continue working towards making Nairobi a regional and humanitarian hub for the United Nations. Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, as we reflect on the theme of this session, the call for unity in diversity in the pursuit of peace, development, and human dignity, it is evident that we must reimagine international cooperation to align with the complex realities of the 21st century. Our actions must reflect our ambition and commitment to a world where progress is measured not just by economic growth, but by the well-being, rights, and dignity of every person. The challenges we face, from climate crisis to economic inequality, demand a bold rethinking of how we work together, grounded in mutual respect and shared responsibility. The achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals cannot be reserved for the privileged few. It must be a shared success that uplifts all nations, transcending borders and disparities. Our collective efforts to combat climate change must be rooted in fairness and equity, ensuring that no nation or community bears a disproportionate burden. This is our shared journey. We must have a say in the choices we make. We must move beyond outdated paradigms of power and influence to create a system of international cooperation that reflects the aspirations and dignity of every human being. We must embrace a new vision of global solidarity, one that upholds the principles of equity and inclusivity. It is within our power to build a world that embodies the true spirit of the United Nations, a world where every voice is heard, every life is valued, and global progress is shared by all. This is the cooperation our people expect, our future demands, and it is the commitment we must deliver. I thank you.
A powerful speech there delivered by the President of the Republic of Kenya, William Ruto, as he took on the world on a number of issues. And of course, having him talk about global peace and stability are right now under threat, increasingly under threat in the world. He's touched on a number of issues, but I won't have this conversation reflecting on the speech of the President of Kenya by myself. Joining me is News Central's international correspondent. We, of course, have Adeshewa Josh. Adeshewa, wow, he took us there on a number of issues. He too also touched on the issue of AI, emerging threats. He also talked about, of course, the conversation and the situation in Somalia, South Sudan, how Kenya has played a role in that, and the deployment of Kenyan troops to Haiti. He talked about international cooperation and how that needs to change. Also touching about the international financial architecture and how that needs to change as well. There are lots. I have plenty of notes, but I'd like to get your thoughts first off on what the President was saying and how that possibly resonated with you.
Absolutely, Tolu. So I had to draw a parallel between William Ruto's speech and the President of Malawi's speech. Both of them spoke very passionately about debt cancellation and the very high cost of borrowing and how it feels like the global financial architecture is designed to keep African countries, presumably in debt for the longest time, where you have a situation where African countries are borrowing at as high as 18% as of last year, and then you have other countries borrowing as low as 1%. It's like light and day. And the conversations around why African countries borrow at such a very high rate is that the perception of risk is really high for African countries, whether the risk is actually true, real, or perceived. Some of these credit ratings companies that William Ruto mentioned, there's a way they have carved their reports to make creditors want to run away from African countries. So when you have creditors looking at us, they see a huge amount of debt. And that's how the international system lends you money. They look at you and say, how risky is it for you to default on this debt? So both of them spoke very passionately about this whole debt obligations. And it is true, Africa is owing at least over $800 billion. And about 65% of most African countries' GDP is used to service debt. So he said many of these African countries have to decide between whether to build schools or whether to
employ
to
teachers,
buy textbooks, or to service or to service their debt. This is. I mean, if it is expensive across the board, it's all right. But if it is expensive just for us, it looks like a real gang up against African countries. But again, it's all about risk perception too.
It's really interesting he took us there, because we see that, of course, that's a sort of a thread, as you said, also picking up from the president of Malawi's speech. And I think we've seen a thread with the African leaders represented at this year's UNGA on issues around the Security Council, issues around climate change, issues around AI as well, which President Ruto did speak to. Bernard Akede is joining us. He is live in New York, just around the area of the World Trade Center. Bernard, you've also followed closely, and I want to move on because there's so much that President William Ruto said, but I also want us to touch base with what President Chakwera said as well. But let's talk about this Security Council conversation. It's been top of the agenda from the very first African president who spoke on Tuesday up till now. It's been at the very top of the agenda. Ruto said that, of course, the conversation around the Security Council is one in which there must be a demand for change, that Africa needs to be seated at the council, that the Security Council continues to hamper efforts to get international peace. Imagine the United Nations Security Council being the very entity or organ or body that is now being a problem for getting international peace. He talked about the fact that it was undemocratic. He called it opaque, authoritarian, and even uninclusive, leaving out the entire continent in terms of representation. And he said it was unacceptable that one country can veto the decision of 193 other countries. Ben, we spoke about it on Tuesday. We're right back to this Security Council conversation. Does it even look like we might make some headway at this UN General Assembly on this issue? Hello, Bernard. All right, so we'll try to establish connection back with Bernard. But Adesha, I know me and you, we've touched on this as well yesterday. We're right back to it with the Security Council. Do you think we could see some headway at this particular General Assembly that is ongoing right now?
I think something is going to have to shift in the international community for it to happen. Remember that the Constitution, the way the UN came about, it didn't come about by people just waking up one day and say, we need to form the United Nations. It was right after the Second World War. And I am not saying that something that dramatic is going to happen for us to have a shift in how the UN Security Council is to be constituted. But when a major shift happens in the world, it is reflected in how the rest of the world organizes itself. So how that's going to come about, I have no idea. But there was something that President Ruto, as well as Chakwera, said. He said, it is no longer looking the way the body is formed. The core of the United Nations, which is the Security Council, the way it is formed, it is no longer acceptable that that system is what is moderating issues of the world now. It is not effective. And the stinging word right there for me from Ruto is it is undemocratic. If there is anything that the 21st century is trying to do, is to be democratic, which means give the average person power to decide their futures. So if you have a system that does not reflect the ideals of democracy that we are now bandying around the world, something is definitely wrong, and it cannot be wrong for too long. How that's going to happen, I don't know. But at least we're having the conversation, and that's where it's going to start, and then someday something will shift.
And it's interesting he mentions that, because he also talked about the fact that world powers are becoming more unilateral. And when you note some of the trends, particularly in Europe and even in the US, you see a greater move towards nationalism than globalism. And that's been a trend that's been ongoing for the past few years. If you look at some of the elections, you're finding more far-right and anti-immigrant groups making headways in national assemblies and in national parliaments. And it's a worry, particularly for people here on the continent and in the global south as well. But I want to talk about something that both presidents spoke about, and that is artificial intelligence. Now, the president of Malawi talked about having AI rules that are already being written by some countries to the advantage of them over the advantage of probably a shared ability to use AI, and that it should, of course, be more than a rules-based system. AI governance should, of course, be something that will not only be regulated, but it also makes sure that competition between countries is equitable and fair. Then we also had William Ruto touch on that as well. He talked about the fact that AI is now being seen in the military domain. There's an increase in cyber threats, advanced technologies, and that the world's most powerful countries are choosing, as I said, unilateralism and the resurgence of the nuclear arms race for geopolitical tensions, and that the vision of a world that's free from nuclear weapons is dying incrementally. Let's touch on AI. If you look at some of the reports, especially as journalists, we're a bit up to date on that. There is a really, really big reason, probably several big reasons, for world leaders to be worried about the speed at which AI is going without regulations, without agreed frameworks on how things will be done. What do you make of that from these African leaders? And remember, we heard it from the very first African president on the first day of these speeches on Tuesday.
All right, so let's break it down and try to make it simpler. AI rides on data. And if there is any part of the world that has serious data deficits, it's Africa. And that, understandably, is why many African countries and leaders are a little bit worried about how they could be left behind with this whole AI thing. Now, don't forget that recently, a couple of years ago, it must be ChatGPT, one of the companies under OpenAI, had been testing. They've been testing their models, and they still do, in Kenya, using our people to test their various models. We have become a testing ground for some of these AI models without any regulation. And what has come of some of those projects is very crazy stories about how people are going through serious mental and serious health problems because they have been subjected to certain procedures to help test those models. That aside, AI is great because it has come just like the internet, the World Wide Web. It has come to stay. The problem now is how Africa is to moderate some of the excesses of AI. Artificial intelligence can clone me tomorrow. We could start an artificial war tomorrow. If somebody else is not thinking, that could be AI, let us go and verify the veracity of what we've seen. Did Adeshewa actually step out there and do something? Or did North Korea actually fire that missile against South Korea? If there are no mechanisms in place to check the excessive use of AI, then the world could go to war without actually supposed to be at war with itself. Absolutely. The point I'm making here is human beings are still at the soul, at the heart of AI. We are the ones creating this thing. AI is not going to work. AI will only congregate and condense the data that is available. And available by who? By humans. Who is going to put the algorithm that AI is going to use? It is us. So at the end of the day, human beings are still at the heart and mind, at the center of how AI is going to work. And that's why it's important to begin to create the rules of engagement. The United States is already working on the rules of AI. The Congress is supposedly working on some policies to begin to establish how AI is being used in the country. All the European countries are already in that same process. Africa, we may think we're far from it, but actually we're not, because we tend to be, quote unquote, the dumping ground for some of this technology. And so the time is now to begin to put the frameworks in place that will guide either our consumption or our usage of artificial intelligence.
And you make a very strong point there. We also collaborate with the continent's leading fact-checking organization, Africa Check, for a show that actually takes on fake news in the course of every week, looking at stories from Kenya, Rwanda, South Africa, Nigeria, Ghana even. And in the past few months, we've seen an increase in stories that we've had to cover where AI has been used to generate fake videos, fake voice notes as well, and particularly hitting at government officials and also whipping up sentiment. So for us here on the continent, it is a very big concern. I do believe that Bernard Akede is back with me right now. Bernard, you are in New York, and these are ongoing conversations. We've heard from the presidents of Malawi and, of course, the president of Kenya today. AI, climate change, which we'll get into, have all been parts of the conversations. But as I asked Adeshewa, just give me your initial thoughts on the conversations, on the speeches we've heard from these African leaders.
Good morning, Tolu. Good morning, Adeshewa. I hope you can hear me now. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Please go ahead.
All right, fantastic. Where do I begin? I mean, it's a potpourri of several conversations to unpack from both presidents, President of Malawi and the President William Ruto of Kenya. Now, both presidents have said things that actually are interconnected. First of all, both of them talked about their achievements so far, what they've been able to do as African countries. William Ruto particularly talked about what he's been able to do within the East African sub-region. There are those who say that when Kenya sneezes, the rest of East Africa catches a cold. And Ruto has been able to mention that Kenya has been able to support the East African sub-region. Malawi president too has talked about his achievements so far. He has talked about what they've been able to, the landmarks they've been able to reach. But very quickly, I don't want to dwell on their achievements now. I want to dwell on the heavy hammers that they've dropped on the United Nations generally. And Adeshewa has talked about that, and even you have talked about that. Now, the major conversation for most African countries or African leaders this year is the fact that there is no representative of all the 54 countries in the United Nations occupying a permanent seat in the United Nations Security Council. Whereas we have some countries, some places where just one country has more than sufficient control or more than necessary power over these, over the decisions taking place in the United Nations Security Council. Of course, that has to change. Now, you were asking me the other time before the network went bad, do I see things changing? I am hopeful that things will change after these conversations because the voices of these African leaders is very loud. They become very vocal. However, here is my postulation. Until the African Union itself becomes strong, I do not think that African leaders or the generality of African leaders will be taken seriously by the United Nations. And I do not think that an African country would eventually occupy a permanent seat, I beg your pardon, in the Security Council of the United Nations. Take a look at this. Our biggest representation, our biggest general representation or general body in Africa, apart from the regional bodies like ECOWAS, the SEDAC, and all the rest, we have the United Nations. But then, even you and I, Tolu, have had this conversation several times. How strong has the African Union been in the past couple of years? Unfortunately, the person chairing the African Union now is our own President Bola Ahmed Tinubu. And in the past few years, we've seen several coups. We've seen unrest. We've seen political issues across several countries. So it's looking like if we don't have our own acts together, how do we expect the bigger body to take us seriously? But that's just my own point of view. But again, coming back to that question you asked me the last time, if we do not see a change at this UN General Assembly, with how vocal the African leaders have been, then I don't know when we can see a change. Having said that, I'll quickly move over now to the debts that President Ruto and President Chakwera talked about. Okay, saying that there are larger countries who have the capacity to forgive debts, so that African leaders can focus on certain things. Very quickly, Tolu, I would like to run through this. I do agree that, if they hold on to debts, African children cannot go to schools, African families cannot go to hospitals. But there was some subtle kind of emotional blackmail I sensed in there. Now, why are African countries going seeking debt, going to borrow monies and incurring debts for their countries. And then now, when it's time to pay back, we're saying the children have to go to school, women have to give birth in hospitals. So first of all, we have to resolve the issues that makes African countries go cap in hand, seeking debts, so that we don't have to come back begging that these debts be forgiven. Simple analogy, you can't borrow money from me, and then when it's time to collect the money back, you're telling me your children have to go to school or your family hasn't fed. I can forgive you the first time, the second time, but over a period of time, you have to pay back at some point.
So I want to bring Adeshewa into this because I'm not so sure if she'll agree, but we'll see what she has to say. Because when he was talking about debt, there's a number of issues around the debt conversation. And Ruto emphasized the need for the global financial architecture to change. And during the time I was on the business beat, that was something that was consistently drummed in by many of the people. We spoke about capital flight yesterday and the amount of aid that comes into Nigeria. There's more money going out of the comes into the African continent, I beg your pardon. There's more money that goes out of the continent than the money that comes into the continent, be it aid or FDI. As Adeshewa said yesterday, some of it's just basically being loans that are then being paid back. So Adeshewa, are you seeing any subtle attempts of saying, we owe you money, but please, we have to send kids to school or we have to pay for hospitals, you should work to forgive our debt? Is that the conversation you see African leaders taking to the UN when it comes to the issues around debt forgiveness and debt restructuring?
So first of all, I agree with Bernard. There was a little bit of rubbing on their faces, like we have to do this, but then we have to pay you back this exorbitant interest rates that you have put on us, but that you haven't put on yourself. So the conversation is, why are we borrowing at a much higher interest rate while you and your friends basically borrow at near zero? Okay, why is it ratio 1 to 18 or 2 to 10? It is largely unfair. And as I mentioned before, if you ask economic experts, they will tell you it is because of risk perception. They see you, they see risk. They see opportunities, but they cannot don't see risk. And you have some of these international multilateral organizations, these credit rating companies who label you. What they're basically saying is you are not to be touched, but if you must be touched, they should touch you with a very long fork, aka high interest rates. So borrowing is part of how world liquidity works. I don't want to go into the details of that, as just a scholar, but if you ask economic experts, they will tell you people borrow from areas of the world that have cheaper interest rates. They go to other areas of the world that have higher interest rates so they can make money. That's just how it works. Unfortunately, that's how it works. So I agree that there is a little bit of admonishing the lenders to do better with their interest rates. But the idea that why do they go and borrow? Borrowing is, the funny thing, America has much more higher debt. Go and check America's debt. Go and check America's debt and cross-balance it with how much they've taken from China. But the difference is everybody knows America is going to pay back somehow. But somehow, Malawi can't pay back that money because it is just perceived as incapable. That's the difference here. First of all, what I hear these two presidents saying is reduce the rate for us. Let us have a fair playing field. If we have a fair playing field, then we can do something. I think that's what I hear both of them say.
And it's interesting you talk about U.S. debt. The U.S. debt is actually $35 trillion. But there is, of course, a larger, deeper conversation.
So what are we talking about here?
So there's a conversation about...
It's just 800 billion.
There's a conversation about how that debt was taken on, what the debt is taken on for.
Tony, could you quickly Google what Nigeria's debt is?
Please, I'll get to that in a moment. I'll get to the answer for that. All right, but Ben and Adeshewa, we're also expecting the president of the Central African Republic to also speak in the coming moments. Gabon's president is on. and we'll be going to the president of the Central African Republic, and I'll get you that debt answer for you. But I also want to talk about climate change, and that also has been a threat. Even Vice President Kashim Shettima, Nigeria's vice president, when he was speaking representing President Bola Tinubu, did also speak about climate change. Now, President William Ruto spoke about how many Africans were affected in recent years. And I like the fact, it's not a like, but it was a very powerful statement that the president of Malawi said that every single year since he has been in power, he's been dealing with a climate-related disaster, that there has been a state of disaster every single year since he's been in power. Now, of course, William Ruto talked about the over 110 million Africans who were affected by climate change and the $8.5 billion plus in damage that has been done. Unfortunately, we've seen a lot of pledges from the Western world and Western leaders towards the money that they will help give to Africa in relation to the fact that we do not produce the majority of these greenhouse gases. Depending on the scholar you speak to, we're less than 5%, some even say less than 3%, but we are bearing the brunt of that right now. And he also spoke about COP29, presenting the world with a critical milestone in terms of what needs to be implemented for everyone, and that we need to reflect on the theme as well. We need to make sure international cooperation is the reality for the 21st century. This climate change conversation, we're continuing to ask people who made pledges to uphold the pledges and promises they've made. And we're going to COP29, and yet Africa has barely received 2 or 3% of the money for these pledges. When it comes to what the African leaders have said, do we think they've hammered on this enough, given how many millions of Africans are affected and what it costs us in infrastructure, in lives, in so many other ways when it comes to the climate disaster? I'll start with you, Bernard.
All right, so thank you for asking this question, Tolu. Yes, every African leader who has spoken has talked about climate change and the impact that climate change has had on the African continent. Like you did say, depending on the scholar or whoever is checking, the percentage differs. Some say that African countries contribute less than 5% to global warming, but then we're the ones who feel the impact of climate change the most. But then here's the point. Several years have passed, and we've seen, the big countries who contribute so much to global warming and cause climate change. We've heard them talk about pledges, make pledges to African countries, but in the past few years, we've not seen any pledges, or any of those pledges being redeemed. Now, we're going around the vicious cycle, and I say this because the question is, who is going to hold them accountable to redeem these pledges? It still has to be the United Nations all over again. And then that brings us back to the topic of how strong, how relevant is the United Nations once again. So you see that it goes beyond just Security Council. It goes beyond just controlling the activities of certain countries. It also goes into having these countries redeem their pledges and promises that they've made to weaker countries, if you permit me to use that language. So again, the main and the basic conversation we're having this year is about the United Nations itself. It's looking like it's beginning to lose its grip on certain countries. It's beginning to lose its stronghold on some certain countries because these countries can make promises and pledges. Over the years, they've done that. But there's nobody dropping the hammer on them and forcing that these pledges be redeemed. The countries in Africa cannot force them to redeem these pledges. Already the countries in Africa are looking up to some of these countries as big brothers to do certain things for us. And then we still have to chase them around to redeem the pledges that they have made concerning the impact of global warming and greenhouse emission gases that they have caused us. And it's been causing a lot of disasters, natural disasters in Africa. So again, these complaints fall onto the table of the United Nations. We have to wait for them to do the needful, and they have to do the needful. I don't see how African countries are going to force the hands of these countries to redeem their pledges so that we can fix the damages that they've made on the continent. The United Nations just has to take charge once again.
On how much Nigeria owes, our debt across all levels of the government is $91.46 billion as of Q1 2024, compared to the $35 trillion that the U.S. owes. But that's a side conversation for another time. Adesha, I'd like to get your thoughts on this climate change. We've heard them hit hard on the Security Council conversation that Africa needs 2 seats and Africa needs veto power. We've heard them hit hard on the AI conversation as well. We've also heard them hit hard on just generally reforming the United Nations to be more inclusive and actually more representative of the realities of today. Are we hearing them hit hard enough on climate change? The president of Malawi talked about, I think it was Cyclone Freddy in particular, and we know for the past few years, East Africa has been in the midst of massive droughts. for the past few years. We also heard recently, I can't remember the name of the country that says they're going to call a number of their elephants because they need to feed their population. We have these conversations happening because of climate change and the impact it's having on the continent. Are our leaders hitting the UN enough on this? It is a very clear and present danger.
All right, so it is not unusual for the international community to play on hypocrisy, which means you say something and then you do something else. I think it's high time we started listening to what people do and not what they say. This is a topic I've treated so many times. Climate change is such a very hard topic to report, in a sense, and because of the nature of reporting it, understanding it, and telling your own people. So I want to start with us before I start with the international community, and explaining to your own people that nature is worried that you are doing something to it. How do you tell people that when you turn on the tap in your house and you leave it on for a long time, that somebody on the other end of the world may not have water for the next 1 month? How do you make that connection? So there was a time, I can't remember the conference right now, when African leaders realized what was happening in the international community. And this whole climate mitigation project that we've been talking about, that countries are supposed to contribute and give to African leaders to establish climate mitigation projects, which is, climate mitigation project, let's say, for example, in a country that is facing droughts, then you will establish like some kind of water fountain, think along that line. That's what climate mitigation projects are supposed to be for. So that when there is drought, you have something that helps farmers to continue to help them irrigate, sort of like artificial irrigation. In fact, at some point, I think some African countries were consulting with Israel to see, because Israel they are the master when it comes to agricultural technology. They will grow anything on a rock, because they have figured out how to just agriculture, no matter how hard, no matter what nature is doing. So it's a concept that will have to start from us. Once we do something personally, because it can only start from us, basically, is the point I'm trying to make. Having said that, the international community, I suspect, is looking at this through the lenses of begging bowl again. Because it's like African countries are now going to say, okay, you did this wrong to me. Give me the money to help myself. Because that's what it is beginning to look like. It has been how many years since that fund was established, and the promises every other COP? Hello, look at it. It's not probably coming as soon as you think it will be. So what can we do within ourselves to begin to mitigate the effects of climate change? I do not think this is the first time that cyclones or that we're going to be experiencing droughts. From time immemorial, African countries have dealt with extreme weather conditions. How did our forefathers survive? I've heard of underground water systems that helped to facilitate irrigation for farmers. I've heard of really crazy technological inventions that our people invented to fix the problems that they were facing. If we continue to wait for outside help, we're never going to get it on time, and it may never come.
Okay,
so yes, let us hammer them and take them by their word, but that's about the best we can do.
I apologize for interrupting you. We have so many presidents coming up, and we're heading straight now to the Central African Republic President, His Excellency Faustin Todera, who's speaking. Let's go to that, and we will be back.
Shining and historic election to preside over the proceedings of the 79th session of the United Nations General Assembly. Your election is the symbol of an honor and well-deserved tribute that's been granted to our continent, Africa. Your election is also a source of great pride and inspiration for 51 million citizens of CEMAC, the Economic and Monetary Community of Central Africa, which I'm currently presiding over, steering the work of the Conference of the CEMAC Heads of State. It is also a source of pride and inspiration for your beautiful country, the sister Republic of Cameroon. Your consummate knowledge of international affairs, as well as your far-ranging personal qualities, are a great advantage and a guarantee that our proceedings will be met with success. I stand convinced that you will do your best to serve the interests of the United Nations and all its member states, implementing the UN's vast reform program so that the organization becomes more effective, more inclusive, more representative, and better suited to our changing world, as well as to the resolution of the serious and pressing problems shaking all of humanity. Rest assured, you have the full support of the Central African Republic in your task. I'd also like to commend the high caliber of the work done and the accomplishments of President Denis Francis throughout the 78th session of the General Assembly. We extend to Mr. Denis Francis our gratitude and our satisfaction. United Nations Secretary General, His Excellency Antonio Guterres, I'd like to reiterate to you the gratitude of the Central African Republic and my country's full support, as well as the support of the government. We support your various initiatives which seek to make the United Nations a place where the efforts of nations come together. As you know, on the 30th of July of this year, the United Nations Security Council decided to lift in its entirety the unjust, illegitimate and iniquitous arms embargo that had been imposed on the Central African Armed Forces for a decade. An embargo which caused us irreparable harm over those 10 years. Speaking from this rostrum, I'd like to extend to you the gratitude of the Central African people. We're grateful to the UN Security Council for its wise decision. A decision which, although belated, will allow my country to continue to act so as to rebuild international and national peace and security, and to work together with other states in the pursuit of peace, sustainable development, and the human dignity of present and future generations. I'd like to seize this opportunity to reiterate to all of you, all those who held the Central African Republic in their hearts and supported our noble fight. You have the gratitude of our people. The Central African Republic has vast mining potential. Therefore, I'm convinced that we'll continue to receive your support for the lifting of the embargo on diamonds imposed by the Kimberley process, an embargo which has circumscribed our ability to work for peace, sustainable development, and the human dignity of present and future generations. Mr. President, the theme of this 79th General Assembly session is leaving no one behind, acting together for the advancement of peace, sustainable development, and human dignity for present and future generations. The theme is tied up with particularly important, significant recommendations, which will be of import in our discussions on the reform of the global peace and security architecture, as well as our discussions geared towards achieving the SDGs. As we know, peace is inextricably linked to sustainable development. Regrettably, as we meet here at this great world forum, year in, year out, as we meet at other fora for that matter, the world continues grappling with serious existential threats, becoming more unstable and more vulnerable. This 79th session is taking place at a very turbulent time, a time marked by mounting geopolitical crises, the war between Russia and Ukraine, the war between Israel and Hamas, the war in Sudan and in the east of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, terrorism, deteriorating economic conditions which are strangling growth in Africa, as well as rising fuel prices. We stand convinced that only dialogue can help us to put an end to conflict in a lasting way. The Central African Republic implores the parties to these various conflicts to opt for dialogue and diplomacy so as to find a solution to the various disagreements at the root of these conflicts and to save millions of human lives. The Central African Republic would like to note that the security situation has been stable for the most part in 2024. We are preparing to deepen our democratic roots by holding municipal and regional elections in the very near future, something that will be a first over the last 4 decades. With this in mind, special measures have been taken to apprehend remaining armed groups. These groups can no longer control various portions of our country's territory. As a result, they're engaging in organized crime, illegal exploitation, and fraudulent trafficking of natural resources, and they're doing this so as to be able to acquire military material and equipment. The 10th session of the Strategic Committee for Disarmament, Demobilization, Reintegration and Rehabilitation, as well as the commemoration in Bangui of African Amnesty Month by the African Union's Peace and Security Council, this happened just a few days ago, were an opportunity for us to fully appreciate the significant headway that's been made and which has been possible thanks to the fact that stakeholders have taken ownership and participated in the global peace and security process underpinned by the Political Agreement for Peace and Reconciliation, as well as the Luanda Joint Roadmap. Despite of the progress that's been made, the Central African Republic continues to grapple with various challenges, specifically as regards the building of barracks, so we can station units in defense areas close to the places from which threats are emanating, as well as the acquisition of military material and equipment for our defense and security forces. Mr. President, climate change is having very serious repercussions. Deadly flooding, drought, and large-scale fires, which we've witnessed all over the world. These give rise to various risks, from food insecurity to water stress to competition for natural resources, as well as losses of livelihoods and displacement. These interdependent, cascading risks can have very serious knock-on effects on peace, security, and development across continents. In sub-Saharan Africa, which is the epicenter of humanitarian crises, environmental disasters have resulted, this year alone, in over 1,000 deaths and 4 million climate refugees, not to mention invaluable material damage, specifically in our neighboring country, Chad, where the number of victims continues to grow following heavy rain, which prompted large-scale flooding and compelled people to evacuate. Speaking from this high rostrum, the United Nations, a symbol par excellence of human solidarity, to express the solidarity of the Central African people to people all over the world who have been hard hit by natural disasters. Our world is being rattled by bloody conflicts. It's also threatened from time to time by deadly weather events, devastating weather events. And in this world, developing countries, which have been impoverished by centuries of slavery, colonialism, and neocolonialism, characterized by multifaceted meddling in their domestic affairs, unjust raw materials prices, onerous conditionalities imposed through the international financial architecture, these developing countries are looking on powerlessly as new security, financial, economic, food-related and environmental challenges mount. Funding promises for vulnerable countries are taking time to come to fruition. Adaptation measures promised at various COPs and rising temperatures, all of these are changing as often as the weather does, beholden to the political, geopolitical and geostrategic whims of the great powers. We're well aware of just how dangerous climate phenomena are. Thus, my country has crafted sector-specific policies. However, their effectiveness depends on climate funding, which is still unreliable. The Central African Republic would like to urge the United Nations to do more to implement the climate peace and development nexus, establishing synergies between climate adaptation and peace building, so as to holistically address the vulnerabilities linked to climate change other vulnerabilities, and the risk of conflict. Mr. President, the world is teetering dangerously close to the brink. The UN peace and security architecture is being subjected to enormous pressure. The reasons Africa put forward in support of its request for legitimate Security Council reform and reform to the veto system are very compelling. A step forward has been taken by the United States of America. The US has endorsed the establishment of 2 permanent seats for Africa on the Security Council, as well as a rotating seat for small island developing states, SIDS. This proposal is praiseworthy, of course, but given changes afoot in our world, Africa, which has for a long time remained on the sidelines, cannot be fully satisfied with this proposal, which can only be viewed from the vantage point of a perpetual denial of the veto to Africa. It is time to speed up the reform of the international financial architecture so as to remedy inequality, to mobilize adequate funding for the achievement of the SDGs, to meet the financing needs of developing countries, to be able to reform the implementation of and compliance with multilateral environmental agreements, which will help us to make our common ambition of protecting the planet a reality. Mr. President, demographic estimates indicate that in 2050, half of the world's global youth will live in Africa. Also, half of Africa's 54 countries would have seen their populations almost double. I applaud the Pact for the Future, as well as the Global Digital Compact and the Declaration on Future Generations, annexed thereto, all of which were adopted at the Summit of the Future. It is high time that we speed up the implementation of the SDGs in the following areas: science, technology, innovation, and digital cooperation. We should do this whilst stressing equity, rights, and universality. Young people today are key agents of positive change. They can make an important contribution to sustainable development, respect for human rights, as well as global peace and security. And yet young people are vulnerable for a number of reasons. This is preventing young people from realizing their full potential and exercising their fundamental rights. It therefore behooves us to pledge to transform investment in young people, in women, girls, and persons with disability, so as to guarantee a better future for us all. As for the Central African Republic, our ambitious 2024-2028 National Development Plan strikes a better balance between the needs and interests of present and future generations. It does this by making human capital development one of the plan's strategic pillars. To conclude, I hope that the spirit that prompted the establishment of the United Nations will tirelessly prevail, thereby helping to create a fertile atmosphere for resolving the problems plaguing international peace and security, sustainable development, and this for the benefit of all humanity. I thank you.
On behalf of the Assembly, I wish to thank the head of the State of the Central African Republic.
And that was the speech there by the president of the Central African Republic. Still coming to the rostrum today, there's the state of Palestine, there's Gambia, Haiti, Sudan, Sao Tome and Principe, Lesotho, North Macedonia, Uruguay, Fiji, and many others. And we still will, of course, be picking them as it relates to context and conversations here on the African continent. My name is Tolulokwe Adeleru Balogun. This is News Central's live coverage of events at the 79th UN General Assembly. But there are other sideline events that we'll also be taking note of. At the top of the hour, we are expecting to have the AI and Sustainable Development SDG Media Zone, which will be moderated by News Central's Managing Director and Editor-in-Chief, Kayode Akintemi. There are a number of events happening. We also are expecting on the sidelines with the global African Business Initiative, Gabi, that Nigeria's former vice president, that is Professor Yemi Osinbajo, will be speaking on a panel that's also looking at issues as they relate to the continent. There's a fireside chat as well with Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, who is the head of the World Trade Organization. And those are events that we are lining up to bring to you, especially as the United Nations General Assembly continues to meet. I still have our correspondents, international news correspondents for News Central, Bernard Akede and Adeshawa Josh, with me. We're going to look now at the speech from the president of the CAR. Adeshawa, I want to start with you, and the reason being that William Ruto did in fact actually mention proxy wars being fought when he was speaking earlier. And there are a number of people who point to the situation in the Central African Republic being one that involves proxy situations. We know that there are Russian mercenaries and interest from not just Russia in that area. The president spoke about gangs that are, of course, working with organized crime and illegal mining, and the embargo that there is right now on diamonds from the CAR. Just quickly take us through what you know about the situation in the CAR and some of the points that the president made in relation to what's currently going on in the Central African Republic.
I think proxy war is a big problem in most conflicts in Africa, CAR being one of them. Allegedly, Russia is involved in some of the conflicts that we have heard of in CAR, but the fundamental issue surrounding CAR's conflict is actually religious. The Seleka Muslim rebels, if I'm pronouncing it well, sometime in 2013, there was this religious conflict between Christians and Muslims. Christian-backed rebels and Muslim-backed rebels, like that. And that lasted for a couple of years before eventually it calmed down. But as always, when there are issues like this, we find those, first of all, the supply of weapons. So it has been said over and over again that if we can block how weapons get to most conflicts, those conflicts will lose their potency, basically. So, and that's where these politics come in. People who are basically in the business of selling weapons to aid and abet the actors of these conflicts. Having said that, another proxy war that is deviating a little bit, digress a little bit, is in the Sudan, that we're going to be listening to in a couple of hours. That's a huge proxy war between Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. So, and basically, when you have other regional interests in a particular conflict, what happens is even if the main actors want to give up and agree to peace, they begin to consider the interests of these proxies, which is a big problem. The CAR is one of the poorest countries in the world. But the irony is that it has about 470 natural mineral deposits, including gold, oil, and diamond. So it's quite alarming that a country that has so much to sell to trade can actually dig deep into its natural resource and make something of itself, really has to go to the rest of the world with a begging bowl. This just, I don't understand it, never.
And I think many of us share those sentiments as well. Bernard Akede is joining us now, the president of the Central African Republic speaking. He did, of course, thank the UN Security Council for lifting the arms embargo on the CAR's forces. And that's an embargo that's been in place for about a decade. And he, of course, mentioned the fact that he hopes to see an embargo lifted on the diamonds from the CAR, given its vast mining potential. And Adeshawa has, of course, taken us through that a little bit. But Ben, looking at the speech from the president of the Central African Republic, he also spoke about terrorism and the worsening economic conditions, touching, of course, on the need and the compelling reasons, as he said, for Africa to, of course, have a seat on the Security Council, thanking President Joe Biden for throwing America's weight behind that, touching also on climate change, and the world is being rattled by these deadly conflicts as well, and urged the UN to implement climate peace nexus to address vulnerability. So he's also again, restating a number of the things that other African leaders before him had, of course, stated. But your initial thoughts on his comments and talked about hoping that the spirit in which the United Nations was established will continue to prevail.
Yes, exactly, Tolu. First of all, I'd like to agree with a lot of what Adeshawa Josh had just said. The Central African Republic is one of the smallest countries around, but it's blessed with so much natural resources. And then it just beats one's imagination that a country like that, with so much resources, has nothing to show for it. And then talking about the proxy wars as well, there's all of that going on. I think, first of all, the African Union really, again, this is me calling on the African Union once again, to wade into certain matters that it should take care of, before the larger international communities, now come back in. Now, coming back to, I'm sorry, I've lost my trail of thought, Tolu. Please take the question again. Coming back to what you spoke about. I'm trying to put everything together.
Yes, given the comments by the president of the CAR, in terms of your initial thoughts and what the highlights of his speech was for you.
The highlights of his speech for me, first of all, it was pretty much, almost everything that all the African countries have talked about, asking the United Nations to take charge and to actually bring to the limelight, or actually materialize what it was established for, many years ago. And it pretty much is what almost all the African leaders have been talking about. Not just the African leaders, but you will see that it's more or less the aggrieved nations that have been bringing these conversations back up. President Joe Biden started the conversation, by saying, yes, the United Nations has been doing so much, but there's a lot more that the United Nations can do. If you listen to other countries who have been speaking, many of them have talked about the SDGs, complaining about different things that have been going wrong in the world. But those countries that are really aggrieved, I would say the countries that are on the shorter end of the stick are the ones that have largely been calling out the United Nations to meet up to his expectations. And that's largely what the president of the Central African Republic has hammered upon. Like you did say, he thanked the United Nations Security Council for the support that they've been receiving. He thanked the United Nations, but largely hammering that there's still so much that can be done. Of course, in not as heavy words as the Kenyan president used, but he is saying clearly the United Nations needs to take up responsibility. And I did mention earlier that outside of the conversation going on at the United Nations General Assembly, many journalists who have been standing outside, a lot of people who are having, well, I say, proxy conversations, are still talking about the same thing as well. Again, I'll bring it up again. It's the same question I asked Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala. Have the conversations changed from last year to now? Are we going to see anything different? Because small countries are asking the United Nations to take up responsibility, to do what they have been established to do, to support the growth of smaller countries, to protect the interest of smaller countries and weaker countries, and to try and reduce the unnecessary strength of the larger countries, so that it no longer seems like oppression. For me, I'd say this is the highlight of what he has said. Even though he touched about several things, also talked about climate change, global warming, different things that have been affecting his own country, illegal mining, or unfair treatment, proxy wars. But largely, all of this can be encompassed into one thing, that the United Nations takes charge and actually begins to do what it had been set up to do, so that countries like the Central African Republic and other countries that are very vulnerable do not continue to suffer when they have resources that can more than support their country and also can be exported to gain more revenue for themselves.
And let's look at some of the facts or some of the stats about the Central African Republic. In terms of the Human Capital Development Index, HDI, of the CAR, and this is the index used by the United Nations to measure the progress of a country, it was 0.404 points in 2021, which is the latest survey, leaving the country at 188th place on the table of 191 countries published. Adeshawa, when you spoke about the minerals, the president himself has spoken about the diamonds and the vast mining potential of the CAR. And we can just go across the bridge, literally across the border, and look at the same mining potential for the Democratic Republic of Congo. And we see similar situations happening there. African countries that right now are, in some terms, powering the global economy, being enmeshed in war, being enmeshed in proxy situations, and having some of the worst indexes and some of the worst stats when it comes to human development, healthcare, security and stability and all of that. You then hear the president talk about neocolonialism in the neocolonialism in a multilateral meddling of their affairs. He basically has said the West is in a new arrangement in terms of trying to get its hands on Africa's resources, and there's a multilateral meddling in the affairs of African countries. What's the multilateral part? What do you think he was really saying?
Oh, he was saying what he was saying. It's the best way to say it without actually saying it, which is, we know what you're doing, and which is a good place to be right now for most of these African people. You've seen them being vocal, saying, we know what you're doing. And when the time is right, I hope they will find a way to adjust. You may have heard a lot of students of international relations, there is one word you will come across, which is the resource curve. The resource curve. The resource curve. It is a resource curve. Most of the countries in Africa that are abundant in natural resources, look at all of them. They all have this problem. They're one of the least developed on the continent, and there are so many interests, bumping into each other, and there is no room for development. When there is no peace and security, how would there be development? The little development you have is going to get crushed by all of these conflicts arising. And half the time, it is regional interest. It is the interest. So one group mirrors the interest of an external group, and they're being paid off or being promised something. So they have to implement the agenda of that external actor to be able to feel some kind of relevance in their own country. I suppose maybe if we imbibe a level of patriotism and nationalism, perhaps maybe some of these issues would go away. It's a good place to start. But for him to be able to acknowledge that on a global stage and a podium like the United Nations General Assembly, saying, we know what you guys are doing, and hopefully we will be able to come up with a solution soon. I want to give a quick example, one of my favorites. It is, when Singapore gained independence. Singapore gained independence just about around the same time. Most African countries were coming out of their colonial law. Well, Singapore became a country sort of at around the same time. And it was Lee Kuan Yew, and they had issues. Singapore is not a monolithic country. Just like Nigeria, we have all these different tribes and coming together. So they weren't speaking one tongue. But there was something that happened because they also experienced a lot of conflict. They were trying to stabilize the country so that it could develop. What Lee Kuan Yew did was he gave a piece of, it's a genius move, but what he did was the people rioting, basically destroying property. What he did was he made them own a piece of property along the lines of which they like to destroy. Now, when you feel a sense of ownership, are you going to destroy it? Most likely not. And that's just one of the policies that he implemented that kind of made some of those conflicts go away. My point being that the countries that are fighting each other over their own natural resources, at the bottom, fundamentally, what these people want, what these rebels want, is a sense of belonging. Just find a way to have national conversations. When people own a piece of their country, they are likely not to destroy it. That's the point of it.
And interesting that you say have a national conversation. The president himself also emphasized that only dialogue can help us bring about peace in a lasting way. But Ben, he also spoke about the fact that there will be municipal and regional elections in the near future, the first in about 4 decades. That seems to be a very massive step forward for the Central African Republic. But in the near future, in many terms can leave much to be desired. The near future could be tomorrow. It could also be 6 months from now. And we've seen it on the West African side of things with the promises from some of the coup leaders who seemingly continue to push the time for elections down the line, the time for transitions down the line as well. But in terms of the CAR, municipal and regional elections in the near future, the first in 4 decades. What do you make of this?
take that question again. You said in the near future there will be what?
Municipal and regional elections in the Central African Republic, the first in about 4 decades.
Okay, the first in about 4 decades, exactly. Now, it's not the first time we're seeing African countries push elections that are supposed to be that should have been held. I think I heard you clearly say. He said in the near future, without giving a specific time period, a specific date. And I think it's some kind of, manipulation by some African leaders. Now, again, if African leaders are talking about democracy, we have to practice democracy the way it should be. And I think sometimes it's part of the reason why global leaders take African leaders for granted. You set the rules of the game, and then you move the goalpost right in the middle of the game. Definitely, the municipal and regional elections have to take place. There has to be evolution of government. There has to be a flow of government. There has to be changes. People have to see things newly. And depending on, regardless of how good the government is doing or how poorly the government is doing, the people have to see the new leaders. Of course, for fresh ideas to come in. Of course, for fresh policies to come in, for things to change. The country is suffering without a doubt. Everybody who knows the Central African Republic knows that certain things are not in place. It's good that the president himself did come out on this global stage to call out the international community without mentioning names or without mentioning different countries. But to use your words, like saying, we know what you all are doing. We're hoping that very soon we'll be able to come up with policies. We'll be able to come out with strategies to break free from some of these invisible chokeholds so that we can control our own destinies. But even in doing that, there has to be these elections, there has to be these transitions of government, there has to be these transitions of power, there has to be these transfers of policies and governments and power. There has to be stable democracies in some of these countries. There has to be stable governance in some of these countries for things to improve. I won't be surprised if some of the issues in these countries, and using Central African Republic as an example, some of the issues in the country is tied to the fact that the democracy of the country is not as solid as it should be, is not in the right position where it should be. So rather than giving vague statements, saying sometime soon could be next year, could be in 10 years, could be in 5 years, there needs to be a proper transition. There needs to be a specific time so that these countries do not look like civilian dictatorial type kind of government where, yes, you are a democracy, but nobody can question you because you've been there for quite a while and nothing has changed. And unfortunately, we've seen this in not just the Central African Republic, but certain other countries as well. Wrapping up with that, some of these countries, still almost the same style, have witnessed elections, but we've seen the same presidents staying in the position for several decades. We have the likes of Uganda, we have the likes, of several other countries as well. We have the likes of Cameroon as well. Whether we like it or not, there has to be stable democracy. There has to be a flow of government, change of governance. In the case of Central African Republic, there has to be elections so that things can move, things can flow, and things can change at some point.
Let's talk a little bit more about these elections. The actual number is 36. These are the first elections in some 36 years. We're already hearing that opposition parties say that they might likely boycott the elections because of issues around the Constitution that they claim favor the president as it is right now. We're also hearing as well from rebel groups who are also threatening to disrupt the polls, which the government insists will be transparent and also help restore peace. But what I really wanted us to get at is the conversation around how much is even being spent. So right now we're hearing that the United Nations Security Force that is stationed around the CAR is going to also deploy equipment and individuals as well for these elections and spend some 1.3 million, I believe, in terms of helping with this election. So we've seen the president of the country on the rostrum, on the podium at the United Nations General Assembly speaking about these upcoming elections, still with no date. We've heard already from opposition parties. We've heard from the rebels as well. And we're hearing that money is being funneled in. There's going to be security and all of that. This is yet again another African country that's struggling to have democratic elections. It's these kind of situations that we expect to see the AU become involved in. It was also, I think, the president of Kenya, William Ruto, that also spoke about the AU being as necessary for the African continent as the United Nations was for the world. When we look at the setup towards the walk towards the elections that the CAR is anticipating, and with the fact of the president's statements on the stage today, do we see some belief that these elections, some faith that the elections will hold and they will be transparent, especially again, as Adeshawas talked about, this proxy war that's happening, how people are fighting through the CAR because of geopolitical issues. Adeshawa, I'll start with you.
So elections, wanting to hold elections is a good sign. It's a sign in the right direction, because what you would hear from ex-colonial powers, albeit behind stage, some of them were critical of African self-governance. They would throw around words like, they don't think we can govern ourselves, not taking into account of how much during colonialism our ability to govern ourselves in terms of systems, having proper systems in place has been crushed. So our ways of life, all of that crushed during colonialism. What most African countries are now trying to do is to revamp those systems that will then restructure the new way of life, as it were, after colonization. But that's fine. 60-something years after colonization, let's look forward. We're not talking about that as an excuse anymore. Central African Republic finally to do this is a great. They've been at it since 2013, and the remnants of war and the conflict is still there. Now, elections is great. I think if you can verify for me, it's MINUSCA should be the peacekeeping mission, the UN peacekeeping mission, I think, in CAR, and it is, again, please verify this, fact check me, one of the most expensive missions in the region. So, and it's because of the conflict, it's because of the rivalry between anti-Balaka rebels and the Seleka rebels, and there's a religious undertone, it's really very sad what's happening in the country. And to crown it, they're not even up to 10 million, the entire country. It's about 6.something million people as of, I think, 2023. So if you check now, I'm sure they're not up to 10 million people. That's less than the population of Lagos. And yet, they have all of these natural resources, they have everything, and yet self-governance is chasing them. But yeah, totally. It's really mind-boggling.
It is a lot, because looking at it, as you're talking about in terms of being sure of the numbers, there was a fifth committee meeting, and that meeting approved $6.1 billion for 9 active peacekeeping missions as of July 1st, 2023. So it looks to be, some would say, not necessarily profitable, but interesting that there are those who continue to funnel money into peacekeeping missions that seemingly have struggled to keep the actual peace. I just want to add on more to this, because I think it's really necessary for us to understand, as the president of the CAR laid out. He just said municipal and regional elections are coming, but there's a lot in terms of these elections. And just very quickly, we know that the elections are part of what was signed in the peace agreements from 2019, which was the political agreement for peace and reconciliation. There has been a civil war since 2013 in the Central African Republic. The United Nations peacekeeping mission is going to spend some 1.3 million in direct funding to support revision of the electoral roll, and also continue its advocacy with other international partners to mobilize additional resources. And I think it's also important to talk about how many people. They're going to look at an estimated 800,000 new voters that need to be registered out of a total 2 million since the last revision in 2020. So there is a lot at stake for the Central African Republic, and we look forward to hearing the dates for these elections that the president has mentioned, and also being able to tie him and those involved to some very strict rules and regulations. Ben, we're wrapping things up and winding down in just a bit, but with the confirmation of the elections, what's going on around the Central African Republic, the Democratic Republic of Congo, we heard their president speak yesterday. These are areas of the continent that should be much more wealthy than they are. They should be better off. Their people should have a better and higher standard of living than many people, than they do presently. And again, we're here at the United Nations asking them to put us on the Security Council, asking them to uphold their climate change, their climate pledges for the African continent, asking them to deal with the worsening economic situation around the world and the terrorism that is taking place and the wars that are spreading from different areas. Are African leaders asking the right questions?
Tolu, well, this is exactly the question that I and other journalists around have been asking. There's so much to unpack. There's so many questions to ask. Yes, African leaders are asking the right questions. I think I'll put it that way. But I think charity begins at home. African leaders have to take care of the home front first before they come to the global and ask questions. The questions are valid. Don't get me wrong. Questions are right. But look, just as Adeshawa mentioned some time ago, the African Union is not in the right place. The African Union is not where it should be. We need to take care of our front before we come forward and asking questions of the global community. We're talking about global warming. We're talking about climate change and all of that. How have we been able to take care of the things going on in our own place, like Adeshawa did mention as well some time ago? You know, some of these challenges basically that African countries are having, African countries can seek solutions to these challenges initially first, and then when it gets to the broader stage, we can now look towards the global community. Alhaji Aliko Dangote made mention of it yesterday at the Gabi event. Additional made mention of it as well. So many other top African businessmen and investors, African leaders also did say the same thing. That it has been mentioned so much that it's become a cliche. Africa's problems will be solved in Africa by Africans. We can just get support from the global community, which we deserve, don't get me wrong. Yes, we do deserve, and we will get, hopefully. But first of all, the solution needs to start from home and needs to start by home. So the African Union and the other regional bodies need to get their acts together to put the continent in a better and a stronger position. Only when we are stronger and better can we come together as a united force, pushing forward our agenda to the United Nations, and then forcefully push that this is what we want as Africa and this is what we deserve. And only then, I believe, can we begin to get some of those things.
Thank you so much. Adeshawa, the same question to you as we wrap up for this time now. Of course, we'll be back with more of these live sessions. But are African leaders so far, in your estimation, asking the right questions? Are they making the right demands?
Oh, yeah, I'm just going to copy and paste everything Ben has said, if that's okay, because he covered the basics and the basics and everything that the leaders have said. Listen, there was a time that the conversation was around aid. Now it's around partnership, collaboration. Okay, there's a whole echo chamber of African leaders saying, please, take your aid. We want collaboration. They are deciding and dictating the terms of agreement. Remember, Ruto mentioned establishing a negotiator forum, sort of, I'm not sure it's a company, but it will establish this negotiating team that would help to negotiate with anyone who wants to do business, whether with this country or any other African country that will subscribe to this service, to make sure that Africans are getting the best out of the deals that they sign on to. I've always particularly been personally worried about what the details of the agreement that we sign. None of those mechanisms or technical detail is usually available to the public. So I hope they have not sold the entire continent for just a piece of meat, which is sometimes often the case, but we don't get to know 10, 20 years later. We need better negotiators. We need to negotiate better. And I think, to be fair, we're a far cry, hundreds of miles away from the way we used to engage the rest of the international community. Right step in the right direction, and I'll say to you.
All right, Adeshawa, Josh, and of course, Bernard Akede, thank you so much for your time. For now, we will be back. We're anticipating the president of Sudan speaking. That has been a name and a country that has come up in other African presidents' speeches, as we've seen since Tuesday. We're also going to be taking a number of side sessions as well and focusing on the Global Africa Business Initiative that has things for us. But we're going to take a quick time out now. When we come back, we're hoping to get into the SDG Media Zone session, AI and Sustainable Development, which will be moderated by New Central's Managing Director and Editor-in-Chief, Kayode Akintemi. For now, I'm Tolu Lakwe Adeleru Balogun. I'll see you again soon.